Thank you, Dr. Sharp. Good evening. Thank you all for being here tonight as we honor the women who, faced with great adversity, paved the way for current and future leaders of the environmental and social justice movement. It is an honor to represent the Sierra Club Student Coalition, a group of passionate students eager to advocate for our public lands, our mountains, our water, our future. I'd like to start off by thanking my mother, who was the first to instill in me a deep appreciation for the environment and taught me that I can advocate for myself and for others. I study environmental policy and hope to dedicate my life to ensuring equal access to safe water because I was inspired by and shaped by the stories of women like Louis Marie Gibbs, who led the evacuation of 800 families from a town built upon the toxic waste of Love Canal. Leanne Walters, who collected more than 800 water samples, uncovering the lead crisis of Flint, Michigan. Elise Keaton, who advocates for all our future access to drinking water as she stood atop the flattened peak of Cayford Mountain, introducing our Sierra Club students to the devastation of West Virginia mountaintop removal. My mentor, Robin Wilson, who stood up against the hypocrisy in the agency meant to protect the environment and spoke up for science-informed policy. Just last week, the Sierra Club Student Coalition hosted Rachel Running, the photographer from Arizona, who inspired in so many of us not only the need to conserve our vibrant US-Mexico borderland ecosystems, but foster empathy and respect for the history of and current communities of Indigenous and local peoples. I was and continue to be shaped by these women. Women who have been called extreme, hysterical, not in my backyards. I stand here tonight out of gratitude to the women before me who fought for their place as leaders so I wouldn't have to.
Because of the women who were the first to attend their universities, the first to join the sports teams, the organizations, the clubs. Because of them, I can proudly stand as the president of the Sierra Club Student Coalition alongside my friend and former president Tal Shutkin and future president Luke Bobe, not as a woman among men, but as fellow leaders from whom I have received unwavering support, with whom I have celebrated and felt recognized for our differences and unique abilities as we work together to advocate for conservation and environmental justice. It is an honor to introduce tonight's moderator, Heather Taylor-Miesle. Heather supported and advocated for her entire staff to participate in the Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion program led by Marcelo Bonta in February. It is inspiring to me to see Heather use her voice and leadership in the environmental movement to bring topics of social justice and equity into her work and beyond. Tonight, as we celebrate women who have led the charges calling out to protect our Earth's integrity, let us recognize that the movement does not stop here, that we will carry on the torch until all are given voice and all are given the opportunity to advocate, to lead. It is time that we are led by the mother and father in Flint, Michigan, who know what it's like to live without infrastructure and clean water. It's time that we listen to our low-income and minority communities who are subject to more environmental threats than any other demographic. As the Sierra Club learned from the Lens on the Border exhibit last week, it's time that we recognize that our way to secure our country's natural resources and face challenges such as climate change is not through isolation, but collaboration with our Indigenous nations and foreign neighbors. As Alexandria OcasioCortez said in the 2019 Women's March, we are here to carry the torch forward. Because when we talk about racial and social justice, we start to extend those issues to economic justice, environmental justice, and the intersectionality and interconnectedness of all our fights. Thank you.
The first question I'm wondering is, why aren't you on my staff? Call me anytime for that interview. We'll make sure that happens. I am so honored to stand before you all tonight to really talk about something that is so near and dear to my heart. First of all, welcome to the Environmental Professionals Network signature event celebrating women who have changed the world through their dedication to not only conserving our natural resources, but improving the quality of life of all people. Tonight, I have the honor of speaking with two powerhouse women whose stories of resiliency and unwavering fight for a better environment has literally changed people's lives. Strong women have been headliners in my life. My mom was the first person who told me that it was okay that I had a lot of questions and that I should ask them. My 7th grade teacher, Mrs. Hazelton, knew that I struggled in math, and she invited me to come into her classroom each morning before school so I could practice and gain confidence. Mabry O'Donnell, my communications professor in college, taught me to think on my feet and that I better have a good argument. Michelle Dallafiore, then Congressman Ted Strickland's legislative director, told me not to give my seat up at the table during my first job. She also was the first to tie my innate concern for justice to my deep passion for the environment and helping people. Frances Beinecke, who you'll hear from tonight, demonstrated smart leadership by wholly being mission-focused and staying above the fray when people tried to distract her with other issues. And another Frances, who's here tonight, Frances Strickland, even today, challenges me to lead as myself, as a woman, instead of trying to model myself as a man, and to collaborate with and empower other women in the process. We're also joined by some pretty great women in this room, other ones. I know that Director Mary Mertz is here from the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, which is great. I don't know if you guys know this, but Governor Mike DeWine has one of the most diverse cabinets that's ever been appointed, and I'm really proud to live in a state where all 3 of the major environmental positions in his government are represented by women, and I think that's going to actually put us on a road to solutions, so I'm very thankful for that. Dean Kress is here, I think. Is she still here? Dean Kress, the first woman of the department or the agriculture program here at OSU. We have a lot of amazing female leaders in our presence and a lot of amazing female leaders on deck, as you guys just saw with Callia. I could go on, but the point here is that women have shaped who I am and have been fundamental to the environmental movement. Leaders all over this country have cultivated, encouraged, and pushed towards what is right. From Rachel Carson to Dolores Huerta to Frances Beinecke and Michelle DePass. These women knew and know that every child, every family, every person deserves clean water, clean air, and a solid future. And they see fellow female leaders as partners in that mission. There is something special about female leadership. In Rianne Eisner's book, The Chalice and the Blade, she talks about the virtues of female leadership and how it most seek to link people together, whereas male leadership often seeks to rank, and both are really important towards getting something done. And that's why it's important that we live into our leadership in our own unique ways. That's certainly been the case of the Ohio Environmental Council. In the last 50 years, we have linked with countless people across the state to advocate for families, to have cleaner, smarter communities, job opportunities through smart innovation, and we have rejected that you have to sacrifice clean water or air for a job. The ladies you will hear from tonight have done the same. Frances, in addition to being my former boss at the Natural Resources Defense Council, has been at the forefront of basically every single environmental priority that the environmental movement has had for the last 40 years, offering leadership, guidance, and strategy to protect people all over the world. Frances was appointed by President Obama to lead the cleanup of the BP oil spill. And legend has it that Frances was actually the inspiration for Ripley in the movie Alien for how a strong woman takes on a global challenge, which I'm sure she's sick of hearing all the time. But I have literally heard Sigourney Weaver say that out loud, so I know it's true. Michelle DePass is the president and CEO of the Meyer Memorial Trust in Portland, Oregon. Michelle was appointed under President Obama to oversee a $120 million operating budget for the U.S. EPA. She created the Office of International Tribal Affairs, which elevated for the first time EPA's recognition of the sovereign rights of indigenous people in the United States. We invite both of our speakers up here to talk with us tonight, and I challenge you all to be thinking about the questions that you want to ask them. I think that I've been so fortunate in my career to get to watch these amazing leaders really think hard and truly live into the linking instead of ranking, really listening. Even today, talking to Frances again for the first time in a really long time, the questions she was asking were all about how can we more effectively link together to make fundamental change that can affect all of our lives. And I think that those are the exciting kind of conversation topics that we want to explore tonight. So if you ladies want to join me on stage, and we'll kind of come on over here. Frances, do you want to kind of start us off and give us a couple of words?
I will. Am I on? Is this on?
I think it's on.
Okay, so first of all, thank you, Heather, for that great introduction, and thank you, Callia, for your very inspiring remarks. I will follow you anywhere. You're obviously going to be a leader of the next generation. And all of you, it's a pleasure to be out here in Columbus at Ohio State University. I've learned a lot today. I enjoyed walking through very quickly the poster session and seeing the broad work that you're doing from Whetstone Park to Sargasso Sea to Fukushima to how we transfer to clean energy systems all across the country. You're working on the right things. We have so many urgent issues to address. So before I start talking about inspiring women, which I will get to, I just want to say I can't speak before anybody without just reflecting on a moment about how urgent this time is. I've worked in this field for over 40 years. I think at every juncture I thought the time was urgent, but this time is different. And it's different because science is telling us it's different. We're facing an enormous climate challenge. The world is changing. The planetary systems are changing much more rapidly than we ever anticipated. Then when we started working on this issue 30 years ago, which I did, you know, we were thinking of the future. We made a huge mistake by saying it was the future, because the future is now, and I think you all recognize that and are working on it yourselves. So we're in a very urgent time, not only from a climate change standpoint, but from a biodiversity loss standpoint. We're facing the sixth extinction, and this is an extinction that we brought on ourselves. This is the Anthropocene era. The damage to our natural systems are coming from the demands of us, from 7.5 billion people who have needs that have to be met every day. And our challenge, your challenge, is to figure out how do we meet those needs while ensuring that our natural systems continue to work. So we need many, many people coming into this field. We need women, we need men. We're in a marathon, but we're also in a sprint. I've been in the marathon. I've been at this for over 40 years, and I'm still in it, and I still have the passion and commitment to see how we make the changes that need to be made every day. But it's also a sprint because science is telling us that we need solutions in place now. Not next week, not next year, but as soon as we can get them. So I really think as you look in your careers in this field, you gotta look at it both ways. You've gotta be running as fast as you can, but you gotta have the stamina to be in it for the long term. And the good news is that makes it interesting every day. It's an incredible career, a wonderful challenge, and one that I hope that you have an opportunity to enjoy as much as I have, and as much as I intend to continue to. So just reflecting on the role of women, clearly our society is changing. It's changing rapidly. We need an environmental community, a community of environmental professionals that represents all of us, that represents women, that represents gender, race, economic diversity, all the issues that come together in the diversity of society need to be part of this field. And we need to look at the opportunities to move that forward. Today I'm coming to you as an environmental professional, also as a mother of 3, and now a grandmother of 5, 4 of whom were born just in the last few years. And when I think of their future, when I hold them in my arms, these little people, one who's only a month old and his name is Forrest, which I love, I think of his future because he will live throughout the 21st century and most likely into the 22nd. So when we are thinking about what needs to be done, I'm thinking about not an abstract future generation, but a generation I'm holding in my arms, and a generation you will be doing the same. And it's just, it personalizes the issue in a very significant way. And when I think of women leaders in the environment, and I want to mention 3 of the elders of the movement and then some more contemporary ones, these women got involved because of what they saw in their lives. It was a very personal issue. So let's start with Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson, you know, the founder of the modern environmental movement, came out with Silent Spring. But before Silent Spring, she wrote a trilogy, The Sea Around Us, and 2 other books about the sea. She was a scientist, a field scientist, an observer, a writer. She had a huge following when Silent Spring came out. She had an audience of people who were waiting for her word, who were willing to take up the issue of what the chemical society that was being brought into the forefront in the 1950s and 60s was doing to our society. She had the boldness to threaten what we thought of as progress. She created a movement, but she was not a movement leader. She was a writer, but she knew how to use her voice, and she did. She was also a careful observer. Several years ago, Yale University, who holds her papers, had an exhibit of her early writings and some of her field notes. And on a small index card, I don't know if anyone here uses index cards, they were before Post-its, and people used to take their field notes on them, not on their computers, but on a 5x7 index card written in 1953 in the upper right-hand corner, she had written climate change. And I will never forget it. It just blew my mind. I thought, here she was in the 50s looking at what the changes were, seeing them, reflecting, and documenting them. That was incredible. And so she created a movement. Second woman, Marjorie Stoneham Douglas. Now, when you hear that name, I know you probably think of the shooting in Parkdale because that was the school, but she was an extraordinary woman who was the grandmother of Everglades National Park. She lived in Florida. She was a journalist. She was a writer. She was a suffragette. She lived to be 108, and she led the movement to create that park. And she was a very fierce person. There's a wonderful quote by another person of her, which was, "She had a tongue like a switchblade and the moral authority to embarrass bureaucrats and politicians and make things happen." And make them happen she did. And she did it because she was passionate about her place, Florida, and what she saw the agricultural industry and the sugar industry and the developers doing to this place that she revered and loved. The third person is Lois Gibbs, more recent, 1978, living in Niagara Falls, New York, finding out that her son was in a school that was on top of a toxic waste dump. And that, in fact, the country was littered with toxic waste dumps that people were living on, going to school on, and being exposed to untold numbers of chemicals. She raised her voice. She became a national leader overnight because, again, like Rachel Carson, she told the public about what the consequence of chemicals were doing to their own personal health. And she did it because of her son and her children and her neighbors. And so each of these 3 women were leaders and created huge change because they were passionate about their family, their place, their heritage. But at the same time, none of what they unleashed could have been realized without a whole army of people, grassroots people, scientists, public policy people, elected officials, who actually worked to make those changes happen, to put them in place. And that's where we need environmental professionals across all sectors who bring knowledge, expertise, commitment, passion, and compassion to make the changes that are necessary in our society to make it sustainable over the long term. In my own career, I've had an incredible opportunity to work with people like Heather. NRDC has had, I think, more women than men. Michelle DePass and her colleagues, in fact, many of the environmental organizations have more women than men. But, you know, we need to go much farther than that. I learned from great people on some of the slides that were up there. Marty Murray, first woman graduate from the University of Alaska, passionate advocate for protecting Alaska's wilderness. She got the Presidential Medal of Freedom. She taught me so much when I was in my 20s, and she was probably my age, seemed young like me. She taught me a ton about how to be committed, passionate, generous of spirit, gracious to other people, but never lose her mission. She was an extraordinary person at the Wilderness Society, where I had an opportunity to participate with her on the board. Also, Terry Tempest Williams, who was up there, an advocate for Utah, one of the great environmental writers of our time, one of the most powerful speakers, raising her voice for wilderness because of her passion for the Red Rock country. In New York, I learned so much from two of Michelle's colleagues there, Peggy Shepard and Vernice Miller-Travis, who created West Harlem Environmental Action, introduced me to environmental justice in the 90s, just as the environmental justice principles came out. I had the opportunity to bring Vernice into NRDC, and I can't tell you how much I learned from the two of them. They created an organization, NRDC worked with them, represented them legally, and that organization has become now a national voice for environmental justice. And both Peggy and Vernice, with Michelle and so many others, have taught and brought so many people into this field, because we recognize that environmental leadership comes from all communities, and we have to work together. It's the intersectionality of our work that's going to make a difference in the end. Two very young people, Greta Thunberg from Sweden. I want to meet this young woman who's 16, who is talking truth to power to the CEOs, government officials all across the world because of inaction on climate change. Incredibly powerful voice that is being heard across the world at this point. And then, as Cassia mentioned, Alexandria OcasioCortez from my borough, the Bronx, although she is not my member of Congress, I wish she was, who has launched the Green New Deal. And when you read it, this is an aspiration for where we need to go to create our society going forward. I think there's been a lot written about it, which is not actually accurate if you read the resolution. The resolution tells us that we need to address climate change, go to a clean energy future, figure out how to create economic justice in this country, provide equitable health care for all people, and ensure that every American has a right to clean air, clean water, and a healthy environment. These are things we all should be committed to. The question is, how do you get them? And I think this is where you all come in. I wrote a book called, now I've forgotten my very long title, which is A Message for, what is it? The World We Create, A Message for Hope for a Planet in Peril. When I wrote that, I was like, the key word there is hope, and I am a very hopeful person. But after I thought about it for a while, I was like, no, the key message there is we, because we will not have a hopeful future if we do not come together as a nation, as a movement, as a people, to figure out what a sustainable future is for all. So there are many, many women in this field. We inspire one another. each day. I'm more excited every day by watching new people, new young women come into the movement, and there is so much opportunity and so much need. I've had an incredible career over the last 40 plus years. I hope there are many years to go, but I hope that each of you who comes into this field gets as much pleasure and enjoyment out of working on the most important issues of our time. It's been incredibly gratifying for me, and I hope it is for you also. Thank you.
Michelle, do you want to say a few words?
Just a few. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm living in the other O state, Oregon, and I flew in today, and I could not wait to get back a little bit more east because I recently moved to Oregon from New York. So thank you for having me. I want to thank the administration of Ohio State, the students, the faculty. I was recently in academia. I know how thrilling this is to actually be here together and thinking that we're all moving towards the same space. And I've known Frances for a long time. As when she said, "Do you want to do this?" I was like, of course. The opportunity to sit and be with leaders who you have been working with for a very long time is one of the reasons why I consider myself an environmental professional. So not 40 years, but 30 years, right? And so I am looking forward to all of the future that's sitting here and is represented. Because when I came into the environmental world, I was younger than everybody that was sitting at the table. I was darker than everybody that was sitting at the table. And I wore dresses more than everybody that was sitting at the table, I would say. And that was then. So there has been an incredible transformation, as Frances intuited, that we have a lot of women at some of the larger environmental organizations, a lot of women that are running institutions, government agencies. I've worked in local environmental agency, a state environmental agency, and the federal environmental agency. And as a matter of fact, when I was at the US EPA, working with Lisa Jackson and many other women, the head of the Clean Air program was a woman. The head of our enforcement was a woman. I mean, we had actually coined a term called the She-PA. There were so many women in leadership, and it was awesome. And really, the ideas that we brought to the table, the way we worked was very collaborative. Providing space to be able to brainstorm and a friend of mine said, have no small ideas. If you don't think big, we are not going to solve this problem, which Frances has so eloquently outlined for us. And I would say, I'm actually going to ask, how many of you here consider yourselves going into or currently in an environmental profession? Okay, I am so glad not everybody rose their hand, though, because no matter what your profession is, yay, environmental professionals, right? But no matter what you choose as your future sector, we need everybody to be thinking intersectionality to solve this problem, to solve this issue. So no matter what you do, some of the women that I want to hold up are women who did not come in traditionally in terms of the environmental sector. I didn't come in traditionally into the environmental sector. I'm a child of immigrants, of course. My father, who was Jamaican, and there's this thing where West Indians, we're known to have 3 jobs, all of that. My father wanted me to be an economist. And when I came back from Tufts University, which has almost as good an environmental program as you guys do, but I didn't take a single environmental course because I was going to be an economist. And I told my father, I'm going to do environmental work. He almost lost his mind. And however, I think I proved him right that this is what I should have been doing. But when you think about what you want to do, I went to law school, and I was keenly interested in the intersection between civil rights, human rights, and the environment. Unbeknownst to me, when I got a clinical at US EPA, when I was still in law school, I learned about where our garbage was going. And some of it was going to the island of Jamaica, which my family called home. And that was the moment when I said, I really can't work on any kind of legal case where I'm just trying to get somebody rich. It just doesn't work for me. I have to be plentiful, mindful, think about how I can contribute. And so no matter what you do in your future in terms of the skills that you generate, you can still be working to solve this problem. Some of the women that I want to mention are not household names. When I graduated from law school and I collaborated with some of the women that Frances mentioned, Peggy Shepard, Vernice Miller-Travis, to start an organization called the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. So it worked on all of the 5 boroughs' issues that intersected with environment and justice, whether it was sewage treatment plants, whether it was alternative transportation and diesel fuels. We worked a lot with NRDC on that. We collaborated with almost everybody out there to be able to bring resources and protection to communities of color and low-income communities in New York. What made me stay there were women like Gwen Smalls and Nina LaBoy, women whose children were dealing with asthma, were having issues because they could not get out of work. They had to be able to take their children to childcare, to healthcare. Actually, one of my board members, their son died from an asthma attack. I mean, in the 90s, can you think about your child actually not living from an asthma attack? I mean, it was the quintessential space where you had women who cared deeply about their family. And that, although I didn't have children at the time, that brought the commitment home to me in very incredible ways. I have a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old now, so now that is, I completely understand that in so many other levels. They keep me very, very busy. Women like Lisa Jackson, whom may be a household name to some people. You know, she was the Assistant Administrator of US EPA, the first African-American Assistant Administrator of EPA, and not the first woman. Carol Browner was the first woman, and Carol actually worked to be able to help move the Executive Order 12898 around environmental justice. And when Lisa Jackson came in, she made one of her top 6 priorities environmental justice. What did that mean? Well, with the insightfulness of some of the CPA female leadership, there was a rotation of community people in the hallowed halls of US EPA. Right? What does it mean to actually open up the doors when you are working through the details of public policy to the people that are actually wrangling with you, the people that are suing you, the people that are writing op-eds and blogs about you, right? I mean, this is some of the kind of leadership that I think we all, as we are working to solve this problem, are really going to have to get used to, understand, and acknowledge. And I think you see some of that in AOC and others who have come up to the levels of federal leadership and public policy, because to be able to fix this, we have to be inclusive. And we will not always agree with each other. But that is what's going to get us to where we need to go. So I'll just pause there.
Now I have a million more questions, but I'll try to limit them here. Before we came up here, we were talking about how very serious our challenges are, and how very important it is for us to have a leaderful movement, a movement where everybody's in the deep end of the pool. That's kind of the only way that we're going to solve some of these things. And you all certainly reiterated that your remarks, the environmental movement as a whole is really always evolving. I think that we've all seen that. I've been in it 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, and it changes every day. In today's movement, there's definitely a greater awareness of what's going on at the local, state, and federal level. What kind of new sparks are you all seeing around the country that gives you hope that we can solve some of these big problems?
All right, I'll start. So, I just got off the plane from Oregon, and what I see is a really amazing movement in terms of civic participation, moving ballot initiatives and measures. The city that I now call home, Portland, just recently passed a Portland Clean Energy Fund, which is really the first successful ballot initiative that links the economy, climate justice, and where we all need to be in terms of thinking about a just transition. So a huge coalition of people, which again, not people that every day sit at a table together and agree and nod their heads together. So labor, students, government commissioners, all sorts of people came together to be able to lift up the opportunity to bring energy efficiency, lower cost to utility bills, more solar power, all to be able to create a fund that can support this in communities of color and low-income communities in Portland. It had a lot of people against it. And yet, however, even up until the final moment, people weren't sure whether or not it was going to actually pass. But it did. And along with the passing of it, ushered in the first African-American city council person in Portland. So there was a movement that actually came together that brought equity in a variety of spaces: the economy, environment, and in civic participation. And that, I think, is one of the most exciting things that I see happening just next door in Washington State. There was also a ballot initiative that did not pass. However, you talk to folks there in Washington, they don't see it as a failure. They see it as, we've prepared for the next time, and the next time we're gonna win, because we put together an amazing coalition. So that's one of the things that I see that's really exciting me, that the power of our democracy is actually bringing forth our solutions for environment.
Thank you, Michelle. So on that same tact, what I've seen just in the last few years, maybe starting in 2014, marching. For a long time, NRDC had a board member said, we need a march, we need a march. I was like, you can't create a march. Marches happen because of energy of people wanting to come together and have a collective voice for action. Well, the climate march in New York City in 2014, wasn't it? Was amazing. I'll never forget that day. It was led by the environmental justice community, Elizabeth Yamper and others in New York City at the front. It was created across the city, but then across the country by people who were fed up and wanted to take action. They thought there'd be 100,000 people there. There were like 400,000 people there. It was an incredible moment, and I think where I'm seeing the spark, and I was in college during the Vietnam War, and we were going to marches quite regularly. That sparked a lot of movements, the anti-war movement, the environmental movement, other things. The amount of energy now coming from young people, both politically, on climate justice, other issues, is very reminiscent of that time for me. It's when young people are saying, and as Greta Thunberg said, we are the people, we're taking the action. We're not listening to you leaders anymore. And I think, we're at an inflection moment in the country where those sparks are happening in communities, in states, in ways that they just haven't happened for decades. And I think that's very exciting to me. I think that is where the change will come. There's a a group called Mothers Out Front, where a mother in Cambridge was like, what's going to happen to my children's future if I don't take action? She started in her town, got them to pass all these clean energy initiatives, then in the city of Boston. Now they have chapters around the country. And it's just people coming together saying, I know I can make a difference here in my community. And that's going to bubble up. And I'm sure that Heather's seeing that here in Ohio.
Absolutely. We have Indivisibles here that have sprung up. And every single day, people are reaching out, asking for things to do, asking for policy support or advocacy support. We see it, especially with students. I can't tell you all how important you are. You terrify the opposition. When you show up and you say the words climate change in Ohio, they listen. And they know that they better get serious about it, especially in the heartland here. And so it's really, I can't tell you, sometimes I think that young people sometimes forget how important their voices are. But when it comes to this particular issue, especially on climate change, keep screaming, guys. Keep screaming. The more that you say it out loud, the more that you demand action, the more that you demand your future be healthy and clean, and that you get the same kind of opportunities that I have gotten as a wife and a mother, to have a good house and a good family, and not be terrified every day about what they're drinking or eating or any of that kind of stuff. Like those, you have a right to that. And so you have to keep fighting. And so I'm super excited about events like these, because finding your people so you can find your voice is really, really, really important. And I think that the thing that we have going for us all across the nation is when people have the audacity to think that they can make a change in their community. And so I think that we all need to have the audacity to really understand that we have the power to make the difference. And they will listen, so don't let anyone silence you. But there's another big difference that's happening.
And I want to retire. I mean,
I want to retire.
I do. I think that I just want to spend the rest of the time that I have to be able to work just standing behind and pushing all of you. When I came out of law school, I don't know, I was young. I don't know, 22, I don't know, 23, something like that. It was the women who were my senior who held me up, lifted me up, and that's what I want to do now. Because because we haven't done such a great job of this. So I want to help you try and fix it.
Yeah, the indicators are all bad.
Yeah.
We haven't done a very good job.
Yeah, we
but
haven't.
Can I just comment for a moment on Michelle's point? I think it's so important as people get into their careers, think about their career paths. I don't think there's anything more important than good mentorship. You know, when you look for jobs, it's not only what you work on, even more important who you work with. And I was very lucky. I had a mentor who gave me NRDC's founder, John Adams, back in the day, in my day, it was all men, I must say, but I had opportunities that I never expected to have, because he, not only with me, but at NRDC, was very, very committed to bringing young people along and really putting them out there in very, significant roles at an early age. So, as you go and develop your career paths, be very mindful of who is that person who's going to be interested in you, who's going to not be looking for you to fulfill their career path, but that they're going to be interested in helping you along yours. I just don't think in the beginning there's anything more important.
I would absolutely agree. I think all of us probably have had, and fundamental, more than, and I'm really glad you're at Ohio State. It's a great university, go Bucks. But at the same time, almost more important in some ways than your education or any of those things. And it's all an equation, all of it's important. But finding the people who pour into you is really, really fundamental to you having even the confidence, also the person to brainstorm with you, the person who will tell you you're full of it. All those things. Find that person who will be for you. It's really important. You know, one of the great things that we have going for us as a movement is not just that there's a lot of different, there's a lot of leaders, but there's a lot of different leaders than we've ever seen before. Historically, the environmental movement has been very white. And that is changing for the good very, very rapidly. And really this focus on environmental justice that you both talked about, as we seek to work more locally with those who are really directly on the front lines of being impacted by environmental justice, especially in communities of color, can you all talk about the new ways that we have to do business and what kind of practices we should be adopting as we do our work to bring more people into the movement? And in many respects, get out of the way.
Yeah, well, that's, sometimes what we got to do, get out of the way. Yes, my title is CEO, and I reflect every day on how I can be a leader outside of the norms of white dominant culture. And however, the institution that I'm CEO of started from the banking industry. I manage, almost $1 billion of a incredible retail entrepreneur's money that he left in trust. It is a tension every day, but the important thing is to grapple with that tension every day and not to just shove it under the table. So what are some of the things that I think about that actually is what we need to be thinking about in how we actually do this work to change the environmental solutions that we're bringing to the table? Well, intersectionality is one of the most important spaces and places. And in our collage, you see the women who founded the Black Lives Matter movement. And the Black Lives Matter movement has a very clear analysis and understanding and manifesto around environment and sustainability. They do not believe that we can have complete and total freedom if we are not actually bringing environmental sustainability to the fore. They intersect it with economic well-being, livelihoods, all sorts of opportunities for freedom to be able to live, work, and play where you want to. The intersectionality piece is very, very important, and I've been learning a lot more about it actually from people that are more in your age range in terms of students, particularly when I was at the New School. Another real opportunity is to learn and understand the Tellez principles. So the Tellez principles actually came about in the mid-90s at a more of a global labor trade meeting that the Southwest Network for Economic and Environmental Justice, SNEEJ, as it was known as, which was a regional environmental justice organization, held. But the principles now have become totally embraced by people that are working on environmental justice, climate justice, the people that are thinking around the lines of the AOCs of the world. And so I'm just going to read out the principles to you, and we could talk more about them and question and answers. Be inclusive. Emphasize bottom-up organizing. Let people speak for themselves. Oh, that's a hard one in my generation. Work together in solidarity and mutuality. What does that mean? That means that you just can't sign on to an environmental letter if you are a labor organization. You actually have to bring the ideas, the solutions into the work that you're doing every day. Build just relationships. I hope many of us know all of us know what that is. And finally, commit to self-transformation. Because if you're going to do this work that intersects with justice, we are going to transform. You will not enter it and leave the same way that you came in.
Thank you, Michelle. I think that when I look over, my 40 years in the environmental field, every 5 years or so, I think the field changes dramatically. And it changes with the times, it changes with the demands and also the opportunities. And, for many years, decades even, the national environmental organizations like NRDC were very prominent. They played a very important role because the environmental protection had been sort of ceded to the experts in a way. That's just totally changed in the last 10 years, I'd say. Part of it is the field has just grown enormously. There are organizations in every community, in every watershed, and many, many, many thousands. So, national organizations can't claim the space. And I think it's so important for organizations and people in the field to really look at what's our contribution? And then what do we need to accomplish change? And then how do these things fit together? Like if you're on a spectrum of activity, what's your piece of it? And then how to be respectful to the others, listen to them, and be open in conversations. What are partnerships? What is it really to partnership with somebody? It's not writing, kind of signing on. It's like, what is their role and what is your role, and how do you have mutual respect in doing that? And I think in Michelle's principles, you have to be in a constant learning mode, open to how society is changing, how values are changing, what is needed to create the voice and the power for change. And right now, and I think we're really seeing it, what's necessary to create power, to get the change we seek, is very, very different, and it's exciting, and it's much more inclusive, and let's figure out how to use it in the most powerful way by being authentic to what our specific role is, and that is relearning. I mean, I'll just say at a place like NRDC, that's a big relearning moment. It requires a lot of conversation, a lot of training, and a lot of bringing in a much younger, much more diverse community of people who are accustomed to that and have actually been trained in that themselves. So there's a lot of, in intersectionality, there's a lot of intergenerational learning going on at the same time, and it actually makes it extremely interesting, quite dynamic, and not only challenging but rewarding. I mean, it's a much more, I'd say, complete, embracing conversation to have when you have everybody who's engaged talking together about how to accomplish change. It's not easy, though, but it's
Definitely
important.
not.
So one more question before we open it up to the audience and the students. They're all thinking about, for the most part, where they're going to go. What's next? What's their 20, 30 years going to be like in the environmental movement? What kind of career advice would you have, especially for the women seeking to have a greater role and impact in the environmental movement?
Well, I mean, the first thing, and this is what you're doing here, is really important. It's important to be educated and trained for what you want to do. I mean, I think that's, this is a field that requires professionals. There isn't any question about it. You have to have grounding in science. You have to know public policy, political science. I mean, whichever piece of it you want to be in, you got to be an expert in that. So that's the first thing. The second thing, which I mentioned, is in the early years, I think the mentoring is just essential. And, I've, in my career, seen, I'm sure many of you have seen, very, very talented people who hire very talented people, but they're focused on their own aims, not on bringing you along. So I think that that's very critical. Then, when you go to work, guess what? You spend more time with the people that you work with than with your family. Hate to tell you, but that's the truth. There are 5 work days, 2 days off, generally speaking. Those 5 days you're with colleagues, the 2 days you're with your family. You really got to love your colleagues. So you want to work in a place where you share the mission, where people are pulling in the same direction to accomplish the same goals. One of the reasons I stayed at NRDC as long as I did, it was an amazing place. I loved the people there. I felt excited to go in every day, see what my colleagues were doing, very, very talented, very, very knowledgeable, figure out how I could help them. And it was inspiring because they were an inspiring group. And I think that, really thinking about, I remember talking to a bunch of graduate students, I don't know, a couple of years ago, and they were, I'm going to be an expert in this and I want to find this place that uses this expertise. Yes, of course, that's true. But that is only a piece of what a rewarding work life is like. So I think you got to kind of look at the big picture. It's not only using your expertise, finding somebody who believes in you, and then finding a group of people who you really enjoy working with, because you're going to be working with them every day for a long time, and that's where a lot of the reward comes from. Shared mission.
Yes, and I would say, try and get a government job. There's, there's a lot of different opinions about the government right now. However, talk about an amazing place to develop some skills that, people are paying you to develop those skills. You don't have to stay forever. You don't have to retire from the government. But once you have a few years from the Environmental Protection Agency or the Conservation Agency or the public utility, once you have a couple of years of that under your belt, you are increasingly more marketable. And you also have some ideas that you might want to launch, partner up with your friend who was your roommate in college, who is now doing tech startups. You actually have something really quickly that you can bring to the table in terms of professionalism. The wonderful thing about doing environmental work is that you collect friends and colleagues your entire life. We are quite amicable with each other, right? And so, yeah, I know that, I can just email you now, all right? I met you today, and it is some of my dearest, closest friends are people that I met 20, 25 years ago, working on 30 years ago when we were younger, working on environmental campaigns. And this is one of the most amazing benefits of working towards a solution that is for everybody in the entire planet. So hold those relationships near and dear, because these are probably the people that are going to, as Francis said, you may be working with them and looking at them every day, but you may be on opposite ends of the country, and you're still going to have an opportunity to be able to think about how to work together. There was one other point that I wanted to make about careers, and I can't remember, but I'll throw it in later if I need.
You can, for sure. But I wanted to make one more point, because I think it's important. Make your difference where you are, right? Sometimes we all try to go into the same office or the same organization or the same political party or the same club or whatever the cause is. Make your mark wherever you are, because there's people who need to hear your concern. They'll be your collaborators. They'll be your partners. They may actually be your opponents, but even that is exceptionally valuable because they will help you understand and fine-tune your talking points. But realizing that your career doesn't have to look like anybody else's, and that you can have a profound impact no matter what chair you're sitting in, and help advance the ball. I think that's really super important, and understanding that that every place needs to hear this message. So fulfill and step up to your place there, because that's really important. Did you think of it?
Cool? No, I didn't. But what's cool is that when I graduated from law school and I wanted to do environmental law, and at that point, all there was oil and gas law. And I was like, well, that's great, but at that point, I was like, I don't want to move to Texas. I was breaking up with my boyfriend who was moving to Texas. I didn't want to move there. So the state wasn't big enough for both of us. Now, there are so many opportunities, no matter what. Every day, I get so many I'm like, oh, I wish that I could start over again because the opportunities are so vast and large. It's a much, much, much bigger field. So good on you.
So we're going to open it up to questions, but before we start, we've got a student video question from Michaela Master and Jessica Griffin that I think we're going to watch up on the screen.
Last week was the second annual Women in Sustainability Breakfast, where over 100 students and sustainability professionals came together to share a dialogue about women in the sustainability field. One of our panelists, Aslene Rodriguez, shared with us that she used to view her gender and her ethnicity as her superpower, that those were the two greatest assets that she brought into a room with her. She shared with us her recent understanding that she is her own superpower, that her gender and her ethnicity add value to the work that she does, but she is so much more than either of those things.
As a female engineer, I felt this had a really huge impact on me. I often walk into a room of all men and think that my values can be placed on bringing a female perspective. Aslene helped me realize that I have so much more to add to a room. I have all of my backgrounds, knowledge, and passions. I don't want to just be the statistic on a website. I can contribute so much more as a female in my field.
So our question for the panelists is, how are we more than our identities, both those socially prescribed as well as the ones that we internally prescribe to ourselves, and how can this understanding empower us to strengthen the environmental movement?
So how are we more than our identities, both those socially prescribed as well as the ones that we internally prescribe to ourselves? And how does this understanding empower us to strengthen our environmental movement?
Yeah, that's an interesting and challenging question. I think, first of all, I think that's hard. I think we all come to our field of interest with an identity. And, we're brought up in a town and we have parents and family and community, and that does shape our identity in a lot of ways. And then we go into a workplace, and that's where, you start meeting other people. People have, different backgrounds, different perspectives. I think, first of all, I'd say you need to know who you are first. You need to be confident. I think Heather said this, confident in, your own knowledge, your own skills. I think one of the things that's interesting early in a career, and reflecting on my own career, as you go, through the first several years, figuring out what am I actually good at. I started in NRDC's programs. I was there for about 8 years. I liked that, but I realized over time that I was actually better on the institutional side of things. For whatever reason, that just happened to be the skill set. So I think understanding who you are is the first step in being open to being able to interact with others, to intersect with other interests. Being open, one of the things about advocacy, and I have had a long career in it, is you become very convinced of your solution, which isn't actually necessarily the right way to get change. And I was talking to somebody earlier going, the environmental community spent 30 years telling everybody they should accept this solution because we knew it was the right answer, which, by the way, is not that persuasive if you happen to be on another side. I'm sure Heather's learned that here in Ohio, but, understanding yourself first and then being open to other perspectives, I just think that's critical to being effective in your work. You can't be so convinced of your strategy that you can't hear other points of view, because otherwise you're not going to find that common ground that's going to actually enable a solution to occur. It's sort of long-winded, but my thoughts.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add is that, when I opened up, I told you a lot about my identity, maybe things you would never have guessed. And a long time ago, I realized that I really can't suppress any of it, that it is a part of who I am, and I bring it every day to the work, and I've still had, maybe even one of the reasons why I've had the career that I wanted to have. I didn't know exactly what it was going to be, but I knew how I wanted to contribute. And the confidence in knowing who you are allows you to walk into rooms of anybody who may look like you, may not look like you, may be older than you, have more degrees than you, but you bring your perspective, you bring who you are, and that, I think, is one of the most important recipes for success for where we need to go.
The only other thing I would add is breathe. These jobs are really hard, guys. I'm not gonna lie. Like, these jobs are, every day, sometimes it feels like the world is on your shoulders, right? Climate change is a big deal. And so taking that breath, and I think going to your point, listening. One thing that OEC's been doing this year is really spending some time with farmers. We're 50 years old this year. We've spent most of those 50 years screaming at farmers, which, as you can imagine, has not been effective. And so we have been really going to the farms. Tori Barron, who works on our staff, and Tamale Apo, they have joined me with our boots on and going out and really seeing this stuff. And you know, we're asking them to clean their water, which seems like a simple request. But this year they have been knocked down by tariffs. Many of these farms have been completely decimated by the opioid crisis. There are challenges with our immigration laws and how they can have workforce development. The suicide rate, we learned from one farm, farmer was double digits in his county. And we're waltzing in and we're saying, hey guys, I need you to buy this 6-figure piece of equipment to clean up your water. And that's important. We have to figure that out. But understanding context, understanding that they truly are the very first environmentalists, right? They get it. And it isn't really they, it is we. And we have to figure this out together. It all starts with taking the breath and deciding not to scream, but to ask a question. And I think that that's been super important for anything that we have done, and especially in the past few years, as we've been trying to really figure out how not to be crushed by the weight of these issues, but to feel productive in all of it as we try to move forward. We're going to move to student questions. I think our first question is going to actually come from one of our Sierra Club members here at OSU.
Hi, my name's Kara. I'm a member of the Sierra Club Student Coalition here. My question for you is, what do you think the effect will be on the environmental movement, and especially on young environmental advocates, when the leaders that we're reaching out to and meeting with are more representative of us in terms of gender, age, ethnicity, ideology, etc.?
You'll fix it.
That'll be the answer.
Done.
Be exciting.
Woo-hoo.
I just have to say that would be very exciting. We're very far from that place right now, but we are seeing a lot of changes, and you know, the more the better. I think actually in our elected officials, things are changing. Well, I mean, rapidly. They're certainly changing more rapidly than they have in the past. So that's really heartening.
Yeah, I would love to learn more about how that's manifesting in Ohio. In New York, where's one of the places that I've lived, one of my mentees is the second Asian American, the first Asian American woman in the New York State Assembly. And, you know, I look at women like Yulene, women like AOC, who get intersectionality, who march, who have no fear in speaking truth to power, are working outside of the dominant culture, and who recognize that while we all have been stewards of this earth, that really indigenous peoples are the real stewards of this earth, and we could learn a lot from them. So I think that I think it's going to be it's already happening, not in every corner for sure, but where it is happening, I think we're seeing some really great results.
I'll just say for the Ohio Environmental Council, half of the staff are serving or have run for office right now. So we have a state representative who now has moved on, a city council member, a township trustee. We have somebody running for judge right now, and another person running for council. And so one of the exciting things that we've really seen in the environmental movement, not just on the Ohio Environmental Council team, but throughout the entire movement, young people especially are putting their names on the ballot, which is really so exciting and terrifying, right? I would never do that in a million years. It like takes my breath away. It's the most active form of bravery almost that you can have. But if you're thinking about it, do it, because it's amazing, especially at the local offices. People are running and they're winning.
They are winning. And you need some critical mass. When you are alone, the system oppresses you. So we need critical
You need
mass.
colleagues, absolutely. Are you going to make an announcement of everyone from the Ohio Environmental Council?
Not,
is
well,
running
except
out
for their executive director. But the rest, I am fully encouraging them to run, and I'm happy to sign up to write a check, but or to knock doors. But I do think it's important. You know, we're in this moment in time, right, where everything seems terrifying, nothing seems impossible, but also everything seems possible. You know, because there's just anything could happen really fast or really slow. I spend most of my days going, wait, well, who's my enemy and who's my friend? Because the real reality of this is that that's not how the world really is working anymore. And it's certainly not in the functional places, which you find very few of those nowadays. But I do think, like, this is your moment. If you want to run for something, if you want to serve, if you want to do something, in a lot of different ways, whether it's getting a job in government or getting elected to office, like, do it. There's no better time than right now. Do we have another question? Can you come up here? Oh, that's Madeline Fox. She goes to my church. There we go.
So most environmental issues stem from individuals putting their own needs ahead of the needs of others. In what ways have you seen that encouraging diversity can help take people away from their own individual interests and give them more interest in the needs of others?
Well, if you're learning and understanding how this country evolved, and I'm sitting in front of a former colleague who is leading racial stratification economist in the country, who now you all have here at Ohio State, Derek Hamilton. If you really, really learn about the systems of oppression, of how hate has generated many of our systems, it may not be sustaining it now, but these systems are still there. You gain a real desire to change it, because who wants to live in a system like that when you really understand it? Because it just doesn't impact the people that don't have money. It just doesn't only impact immigrants. It just doesn't impact people of color. It impacts white people just as much as everybody else, because we're in this overlay of a sort of oppressive, systemic space. So that's why I think what you brought up could really help us move forward.
I would just add to that I think that fundamentally the environmental harms and the threats to the planet's systems, they're caused by the demands of people, but the consequences of them are also incredibly human. And I think this is where, again, the environmental community is sort of fallen down and really talking about the human consequences. When I look at climate change, it's going to be devastating, most devastating to the poorest people in the world. People who do not have carbon footprints of any size, who did not contribute to the problem, people who live in very low-lying areas, have, extreme weather events, infectious disease vectors, all these things. There will be literally several billion people in the world who will be harmed in this century and something that they didn't cause. So I think the human dimension is really, really important, whether it's asthma levels in inner cities, it's sea level rise affecting poor communities up and down the coast, it's droughts, fires that burn people out of their homes. There's a huge human story here, and I think the more we embrace that story, the more engaged people will become in needing to solve it for the well-being of not only themselves and their own community, but for humanity at large. And I think we really didn't talk about that for the longest time, but to me, right now, that's the central issue. The central issue to solving this is really a human issue. It's about the well-being of people, all of us.
I think we also probably need to start to come out as environmentalists. That sounds really silly and kind of stupid. The same book, it's called it's How Change Happens by Leslie Crutchfield. My staff is smirking because they've heard me talk about this book so much, and I made them all read it. But she says not just to be leaderful, but to really own, your priorities and your values. And one of the great things, if you look at movements that work, right? One of the movements that had a very, very dramatic quick shift was the LGBT movement, specifically with gay marriage. And the reason that it's shifted was because people started to name their priorities, to name their values. It turned out that a lot of people agreed, right? And so it was fast, but it came by word of mouth, which I think is actually really powerful. So again, naming climate change is something that you care about. Naming clean water is something that you care about. Those kind of things, it may seem little, it may seem that you're only one person and you telling your personal story is not good enough. But if you tell somebody about why you couldn't play outside as a child because you had asthma, or if you talk about, like, I came from a community where the water you couldn't drink. My little brother still lives in that community where the water, sometimes you can drink it, sometimes you can't. And that's in Ohio and on the West Virginia border there. And so that's not some third world country. And so the reason I do this work is because of clean water. And so I name that. And so I think that for us to be able to put truth to power and come out as folks who care about these issues and share our personal stories is really, really important. Do we have other questions? Back here? Yeah, and people can just start coming up, like, it's totally fine. We won't bite, probably. I'm sure you can handle it.
So to kind of go along the thread of personal responsibility brought up by Maddie, many of these problems, some of them are not caused by individuals, but instead by corporations trying to publicize the cost of their waste and the cleaning up of their messes. Particularly, one of the biggest advocates for personal responsibility when it comes to driving alternatives is BP, one of the biggest oil companies. So how do we as citizens hold these companies and even governments accountable, especially when there's so many monopolies and the power of purse appears to be less and less effective?
Well, I think there are lots of ways to do that. The first is there's the power of the consumer, which I think is more and more powerful because companies want to sell their products, and if people aren't going to buy them, that has a big impact. On major corporations, shareholder resolutions really are increasingly having an impact. The divestment movement is beginning to have an impact. Basically public information on how, for example, the fossil fuel industry has had knowledge about climate change and chose to ignore it is just, very, very damning and perhaps creates a real liability for them in the end. So I think there are a lot of organized actions that can be taken against corporations once their footprint, their impact is seen. Certainly litigation, NRDC has a long history of litigating, largely against actually government for lacking enforcement of their rules. People look at an NRDC, they go, oh, they're suing those corporations all the time. It's actually not true. They're mostly suing the government to do their job that is indicated in the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, et cetera. But litigation is an important tool, and I think is being used more and more powerfully. So there are ways to connect with the movements that are holding corporations accountable, and I think doing that is having more and more impact. I mean, it's interesting to me, and we haven't talked a lot tonight about corporations, but now every corporation has a green plan, has a sustainability plan, has a strategy to reduce their carbon emissions. At least that's their public profile. And I think that one thing is really essential is for documentation of that, is for a third-party reality check of what was the goal that they were setting, and has that goal been achieved? And also, are those companies that, for example, are making commitments on reducing their carbon emissions and talking publicly about their concern about climate change, well, they may be buying clean power, all renewable, that's great, but are they actually a voice in Congress to get policies in place that will address this issue on a much more comprehensive way? Probably not, and I think that's where accountability has to come in. There's a need for action and transparency on what the commitment is and then what the actuality is, and more of that work needs to be done.
I would add the opportunity that we have now in terms of, we're in an era of globalization, but it's not okay for corporate citizens to not do things here and do them other places, or vice versa. And so the opportunity that we all have in this room now with so many tools is to organize globally to ensure that we really have one standard for living as a human race.
And I would just add, go take them over. Like, seriously, you all are environmental professionals. This is the Environmental Professionals Network. Go work for them, work your way up the corporate ladder, take them over. I mean, we have, and I know that sounds, somebody told me the other day that I sounded very Koch brothers with a lot of my things. But I'm like, but they're winning sometimes, so maybe we should look at it. But seriously, be better. You're young. So be better. Go out into the world, make fabulous decisions. Go back to kind of the fundamental principles of indigenous people, 7 generations. Think about those future generations whenever you're making your decisions. You guys are going to go do amazing things. OSU has a great alumni network. When I have an opening, we are badgered with people coming in, and it's great. And so you have opportunities to do amazing things in your life, and go do that. That's it. I don't know. So I think that's our sorry. You guys, you should let them and Jeff, not me.
I have one other thing that I want to be able to speak to my sisters in the audience here. Okay, so guys, don't listen to this for a minute. So when I was working in the federal government, and you would go to meetings in the White House and all that, and you sit around a table and you say something, and then a gentleman says it to your right, and everybody's like, yes, 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 yes. Okay, I'm over that, right? So we came up with a system of amplification, so that when one of us women would say something in a room, there would be another woman who was across that would amplify it, say, yes, just like Michelle said, right? And so that's the power of sisterhood. Don't beat each other up. Be sisters and amplify. because there are some things we have to overcome in terms of history, in terms of gender rights and all of that. So don't forget that too.
Well, that's wonderful.
Thank you, Michelle.
As is our tradition at the Environmental Professionals Network, we have a certificate of appreciation that we'd like to give to each one of you with the graphic that was specifically designed for this particular program.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And Callia, we have one for you too. This is a wonderful program. We really appreciate your taking the time to join us today. I want to give it a shout out to Joe Campbell, who championed this event and
Thank
really
you,
did
Joe.
Jeff, can I say something about that? So there are very few men who make space sometimes. It's getting better. Joe actually has done such an excellent job of not just making space for women to have great discussions, but diversity, equity, and inclusion discussions. And I just want to make sure that folks know what a resource that we really have here in Central Ohio of somebody who's really trying to thoughtfully bring folks together for hard discussions that are really important. And so we're all really grateful to have him here, and thank you too, Jeff.
Yeah. Well, it's wonderful. Thank you, Joe. As part of the Environmental Professionals Network, we're constantly trying to find ways to challenge ourselves and sort of create community, as well as sort of like open ourselves to new ideas. I do want to share with you in terms of if this is your first time event here, we do have regular monthly events. We have our next scheduled ones planned, and I wanted to give a heads up on those. May 14th, we're going to be doing a program co-hosted with Ohio State University Extension. You will hear two very recent and interesting stories that highlight the potential of power for community development to contribute to community well-being. So taking some of this idea of sort of like how do we take our diversity and marshal it and sort of like affect change. We're going to talk to some groups that have had some extraordinary success, including the Guernsey County Foundation, and as well as the Save the Crew movement. We'll have some leadership here to tell us about their overarching efforts to sort of like bring their community together and how they've tapped diverse networks to make these efforts work. So we invite you to consider these themes with us as we look at how they can be applied to the Environmental Professionals Network, environmental movement. If we could figure out how to save the climate like we save the crew, we'd be making some great progress in America. Registration is available at epn.osu.edu. And those of you who are into science or environmental education, in July, we're going to go on the road and actually go out to Granville, visit the Jim Redding, who's a North American Association for Environmental Education K-12 Educator of the Year award winner, and Jeremy King, the Director of Sustainability for Denison University, to explore that community's environmental science curriculum and strategies to engage students in hands-on learning activities on a variety of agriculture and renewable energy projects. So if you know of a high school teacher or a elementary or middle school teacher that would like to have a chance to sort of like see some hands-on sort of environmental education stuff, we'd love to invite you to that July event. So please stay tuned, epn.osu.edu. You've been a wonderful audience. This has been a great panel. One last round of applause, and then we'll see you all next time.